August 1943. The Sicilian campaign was almost over. American forces under General George S. Patton had fought their way across the island in just over a month, racing British General Bernard Montgomery to Messina in a campaign as much about pride as strategy. Patton had pushed his Seventh Army hard, sometimes recklessly, driving his men through mountainous terrain and brutal heat to beat Montgomery to the finish line. He had won that race. He was, at that moment, one of the most celebrated commanders in the U.S. Army, a man whose aggressive style of warfare had produced real results at a point in the war when the Allies badly needed them. Within weeks, he would nearly destroy his own career, not on a battlefield, but inside 2 field hospital tents, over the course of 2 separate encounters with exhausted, frightened young soldiers. This is the story of what happened, why it happened, and how it changed the trajectory of the man who would later lead the drive across France. The context behind the anger. To understand what happened in those hospital tents, it helps to understand what Patton believed about fear itself. He came from a military tradition and a personal philosophy that treated courage as something a man chose moment to moment through sheer force of will. He had written to his subordinate commanders earlier in the Sicilian campaign, instructing them that soldiers claiming psychological injury without a visible wound should not be permitted to occupy hospital beds needed for the physically wounded. In his view, hospitals were being used as a refuge by men who simply lacked the nerve to keep fighting, and he worried that if word spread through the ranks that a soldier could escape combat by claiming his nerves were shot, discipline across the entire army would collapse. This was not a fringe view for the era. Military medicine in 1943 was still catching up to what would later be understood about combat stress. The diagnosis available to doctors at the time, psychoneurosis or battle fatigue, was poorly understood even within the medical establishment, and there was genuine disagreement among commanders about how to handle it. But Patton's position was more extreme than most, and his temperament, quick to anger, prone to theatrical displays of toughness, made him particularly unsuited to handle these cases with any restraint. The first incident. On August 3, 1943, Patton visited the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia, Sicily. He made a habit of touring field hospitals during campaigns, partly out of genuine concern for wounded men, partly because he believed his presence boosted morale. He would move bed to bed, praising soldiers, sometimes pinning medals on the spot. That day, he stopped at the cot of Private Charles H. Cool, a 24-year-old soldier from Mishawaka, Indiana. Cool showed no visible wounds. When Patton asked what was wrong with him, Cool reportedly answered that he guessed he couldn't take it. Cool had been diagnosed with what doctors at the time called psychoneurosis, what today would likely be recognized as combat stress reaction or post-traumatic stress. He had been pulled from the line after roughly 8 months of continuous combat. Patton had no patience for this. He believed deeply and sincerely that so-called shell shock was often a mask for cowardice, a way for men to escape the dangers their comrades faced without complaint. He had said as much in memos to his commanders earlier that summer, ordering that any soldier without a physical wound who claimed to be unable to fight should not be treated as a hospital case but should be sent back to his unit and, if necessary, court-martialed for cowardice. When Cool gave his answer, Patton exploded. He cursed at the young private, called him a coward, then slapped him across the face with his gloved hand, hard enough to knock his helmet liner off. He grabbed Cool by the collar and shoved him toward the tent flap, ordering him back to the front, shouting that he wouldn't have brave men seeing this yellow bastard sitting there. Then he struck him a second time. Doctors and nurses in the tent were stunned into silence. Cool, still dazed, was later examined afterward. He was later diagnosed with malaria and chronic diarrhea in addition to his psychological exhaustion, physical conditions that had gone undiagnosed in the chaos of the campaign. Patton wrote about the incident in his own diary that night, showing no real doubt about what he'd done. He described such men as disgracing the army and said he had no use for them. To him, this was discipline, not cruelty. The second incident. A week later, on August 10th, Patton visited the 93rd Evacuation Hospital and found Private Paul G. Bennett, a soldier from the 17th Field Artillery Regiment who had served in the Army for nearly 5 years. Bennett had a fever and had been in and out of the hospital multiple times with symptoms of extreme anxiety. Days earlier, a close friend in his unit had been badly wounded, and Bennett, already worn thin from continuous shelling, had begun shaking uncontrollably and asked to be taken off the line. Patton approached his cot and asked what was wrong, when Bennett, who was visibly trembling, said his nerves were shot and that he couldn't stand the shelling any longer. Patton's reaction was immediate and even more violent than the first incident. He called Bennett a coward, told him he ought to be lined up against a wall and shot, then slapped him hard enough to knock his helmet off. When Bennett began to cry, Patton slapped him again, then reportedly drew his pistol part way from its holster, ranting that he ought to shoot him himself, right there, to spare the army the trouble. The hospital's commanding officer, Colonel Donald Currier, stepped in and physically placed himself between Patton and the soldier. Patton, still shouting, ordered that Bennett be sent back to the front immediately, refusing to let him remain hospitalized. He continued to berate the medical staff on his way out, accusing the entire ward of coddling cowards. This time, witnesses did not stay silent. The fallout. Several doctors and nurses who witnessed the second incident filed formal reports up the chain of command. The hospital's chief medical officer sent a report directly to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Patton's superior and the overall Allied commander in the Mediterranean theater. Eisenhower was stunned and deeply concerned, not only by the cruelty of what had happened, but by what it could mean if the story became public. Eisenhower moved carefully. He did not relieve Patton of command. He valued Patton's aggressive battlefield instincts too highly, and the war in Europe was far from over. Instead, he sent Patton a blistering private letter demanding that he personally apologize to both soldiers, to the doctors and nurses who witnessed the incidents, and to every division under his command. Eisenhower made clear that Patton's future in the Army depended on it, and that repeated behavior like this would end his career outright. Patton, to his credit, complied, though reluctantly at first. He personally apologized to Cool and Bennett. He then traveled to units across Sicily, standing in front of assembled soldiers to admit what he had done and express regret, though some who were present later said his apologies sounded stiff, almost forced, more like a man following orders than one who had changed his mind. For months, the story stayed out of the press. Reporters covering the Sicilian campaign had learned what happened, but by mutual agreement among war correspondents, none of them published it, largely because they believed Patton was too valuable to the war effort to lose over the incident, and because wartime censorship discouraged stories that could embarrass senior commanders. That changed in November 1943, when American radio commentator Drew Pearson broke the story on his national broadcast, telling millions of listeners that a top American general had struck shell-shocked soldiers in a military hospital. The public reaction was immediate and fierce. Newspapers across the country picked up the story within days. Members of Congress stood up in session to call for Patton's removal, some demanding a formal court-martial. Letters poured into the War Department, many from the families of servicemen, some outraged that a general would strike a man suffering psychologically for his country, others defending Patton, arguing that discipline and toughness were exactly what a wartime army needed and that soft treatment of frightened soldiers would only get more men killed. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was reportedly briefed on the controversy directly, and the War Department found itself managing not just a personnel problem, but a full-blown public relations crisis in the middle of a war. Eisenhower, who had already privately reprimanded Patton months earlier, now had to defend his decision publicly, even as pressure mounted from Washington to relieve one of the Army's most capable field commanders at a moment when the invasion of France was being planned. Eisenhower held firm on his decision not to relieve Patton of command, but the damage to Patton's reputation was severe and immediate. He was pulled from consideration for a key command role in the invasion of Normandy that was already taking shape. Command of the invasion's spearhead forces went instead to General Omar Bradley, a subordinate Patton had once outranked and openly considered his junior. For nearly a year, Patton was effectively sidelined from major combat command, assigned instead to head the First U.S. Army Group, a phantom force created as part of Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception campaign designed to convince German intelligence that the invasion would land at Calais rather than Normandy. It was strategically important work, since German commanders genuinely feared facing Patton in the field and kept forces in reserve waiting for an attack that never came. But for a man who measured his worth in battlefield command, it was a demotion in every sense that mattered to him personally. A year spent as a decoy, while lesser-known generals prepared to lead the actual invasion. What it revealed. The slapping incidents exposed something true about Patton that both defined and limited him. He believed fiercely in toughness, in the idea that fear could be willed away, that hesitation on a battlefield cost lives. In many respects, that philosophy made him one of the most effective tank commanders of the war, aggressive, fast-moving, willing to take risks that more cautious generals avoided. But that same philosophy blinded him to the reality of what combat stress actually was. Cool and Bennett were not shirking their duty. Both had already served extensively in combat, further than many soldiers ever would. What they were experiencing is now understood by military medicine as a legitimate psychological injury, one that today's Army treats with the same seriousness as a physical wound. Patton never fully abandoned his views. Even after his forced apologies, he continued to express in private writings that he believed most cases of combat fatigue were exaggerated. But he did learn, at least publicly, to restrain himself. There is no record of him striking another soldier for the remainder of the war. The redemption. Eisenhower's gamble on keeping Patton eventually paid off. 9 months after the incidents became public, Patton was given command of the Third Army for the invasion of France. What followed was a spectacular display of mobile warfare in American military history. The breakout from Normandy, the race across France, and later the emergency pivot to relieve the besieged 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. None of it erased what happened in those 2 hospital tents in Sicily. Charles Cool and Paul Bennett both survived the war. Cool later said in interviews that he held no lasting grudge, that he understood Patton was under enormous strain himself, though he never excused what had happened. Bennett rarely spoke publicly about the incident at all. What remains is a complicated portrait, a brilliant, relentless commander whose greatest strength, an unshakable belief that willpower could overcome anything, became, for 2 soldiers on 2 August days in Sicily, his gravest failure of judgment. A brilliant, relentless commander who drove an army across France and relieved a besieged division in winter. And the same man who struck a trembling 20-year-old in a canvas hospital tent in Sicily and called it discipline.